It's Orktober, the month all about orcs, oryx, and back to orcs, but this time spelled with a K instead of a C, where all the Warhammer YouTubers pretend that we give a shit about anything but the Imperium of Man and Chaos. And naturally, I'm here to give you all the content that you deserve. That's right, for the first video of the month of the Green Lads, I'm going to be talking to you all about Craftworld Iyanden. What? I said it's the content you deserve, and you deserve to have elves shoved down your goddamn throat until you love them as much as I do. Besides, I only give a damn about the Eldar, not the Imperium. I'm already different enough with that. But I'm also lazier than any other Warhammer YouTuber, so there's all the differences that you need. And so, in the spirit of not only missing out on the orc content, but also missing out on the Leagues of Otam Bun Rush, here's some more Eldar content. I'm sure the 5 of you who are going to stick around with this video will find it very enlightening. Anyways, Craftworld Iyanden begins as all the Craftworlds do, running away from the consequences of the Eldar's own actions. In all fairness to the Craftworlders, and to spite everyone who always says the Eldar did it to themselves with the predictability of the tides, the Craftworlds were the ones who weren't doing the horrible space orgies thing, thank you very much. Anyways, Iyanden had not only made it out of the ensuing birth of Slaanesh alive, but with more Eldar on it than any other Craftworld, already cementing their cultural and military power this early on. To further make them stand out, Iyanden was one of the few Craftworlds to, as a whole, decide to pick themselves up and try to make something out of the galactic fustercluck the surviving Eldar had been left with. They started this off by inventing the infinity circuits all Craftworlds now have. Whenever an Eldar dies, if their soul gets caught in the soul stone, it gets shoved into the infinity circuit to hang out in purgatory for the rest of time. Or realistically, until they need to shove it into a wraith guard to help the Craftworld's military. They gifted this technology to all the other Craftworlds and asked them if they wouldn't mind helping Iyanden rebuild a shadow of their former glory. And in response to being asked to do something, the rest of the Eldar told Iyanden to piss right the hell off. Very kind folk, the Eldar are. That is to say, all but one other Craftworld told them to do so. No, it wasn't Ulthwaite, the Craftworld full of psychics who would presumably be able to see that recolonizing planets could only help the Eldar. It was Biel-Tan, the murder hobo Craftworld who quite liked the idea of building back up an unchallenged galactic empire. Together, this dynamic duo embarked on quite the profitable affair at first. Biel-Tan would make sure that anything on a chosen planet was turned into fertilizer, and then Iyanden would colonize it so that hopefully soon-to-be reborn Eldar Empire would have, you know, a basis with which to call itself an empire. Kinda important, I would argue. In fact, there were very few, if any, chaotic incursions or strongholds in the eastern portion of the galaxy early on, entirely because of these two Craftworlds clearing it out whenever it reared its ugly head. I would just like to point out that this means Macragge and the Ultramarines only ever became a thing because the space elves let them develop free of chaos. Feel free to thank and or curse these Craftworlds as your personal tolerance for the Smurfs dictates. Of course, nothing good lasts forever, especially given that this is 40k, so naturally the alliance would fall apart. Iyanden was probably the Craftworld to put the blame on for this, though at the same time it's hard to blame him for it. Biel-Tan was becoming more and more murder hobo-y as time passed, and this made Iyanden a bit uncomfortable. They had gone from cleansing the galaxy of chaotic incursions to murdering every single non-Eldar in their way, and Iyanden just wanted to restart the Eldar Empire, not brutally murder every single race in the galaxy. Iyanden in fact actually had a policy of making friends with the other aliens in the galaxy whenever they could. Hell, they even for a while would have one of their families play host to an Inquisitor, which is the epitome of xenophilia by 40k standards. But this was all very much in the spirit of singing around the campfire with the new friends, and Biel-Tan would prefer those friends be the fuel for the campfire, so they cooperated less and less until Iyanden cut ties off. But hey, at least Iyanden was still the most populated Craftworld. They even made a few other friends in their neck of the galaxy, Craftworlds Malantai and Idhare. Sure, they weren't the biggest bunch of Eldar around, but they were still steadfast and reliable friends, so it counts for something. At one point, they even cooperated with the Dark Angels to help them recapture a Fallen that the Eldar had coincidentally put in their own crosshairs. See? Iyanden gets shit done. Then things started to get bad, because the Tyranids were happy to make sure the Eldari weren't forgotten about. Soon they found themselves coming into conflict with the High Fleet Naga. Initially, Iyanden didn't come out of their contact with the Tyranids too scuffed up. Malantai is best remembered nowadays as being a part of the Doom of Malantai, so 3 guesses as to how that Craftworld is doing. Idhare, well, they were doing better in that they still existed. At least they did until a random Space Marine chapter called the Invaders decided, fuck them, and ransacked the Craftworld and killed everyone on it. Because of course a single chapter of Space Marines can do that to an entire planet-sized ship. Why the hell not? God, I hate Space Marine author wanks so much. But to move on, Iyanden was doing alright. Dealt with High Fleet Naga with relatively few losses, and overall they were feeling pretty good about themselves. Then Chaos started digging around in the eastern arm of reality again. See, unlike when they were allied with Biel-Tan, Iyanden not only had no allies to help them stop the incursions anymore, but also the Imperium had united all of these worlds under one banner. That second part sounds like a good thing until you realize that with them being connected, it's that much easier for Chaos to infiltrate from one planet to another. Just one cargo ship with a stowaway sacrificing to the wrong god, and all of a sudden you've got a cult spread across the entire sector. Faced with this grim reality, Iyanden started its soon-to-be regular thing of rousing their dead into wraith units to fight off their enemies. To be fair, it worked wonders for them, even if this was barely tolerated state-sanctioned necromancy at best, and then things went real bad real quickly. Some of those chaotic fellows decided that if a single chapter of Space Marines can wipe out a craft world, then a whole bunch of Chaos-aligned ships can do the same. Unfortunately for them, Iyanden is one of the big 5 craft worlds and so comes equipped with much better plot armor. Plus, Iyanden was led by Prince Iriel. Sure, he was an arrogant dickhead even by Eldar standards, but he was a really intelligent and resourceful arrogant dickhead. That being said, he also deployed every single ship in the craft world's arsenal and started clowning on the Chaos fleet, with not a single one left in reserve from capital ships to fighters. Being intelligent and being wise, you see, are quite different things. And sure enough, the Chaos fleet was promptly mulched, but not before it got one last fuck you in for good measure. 36 cyclonic torpedoes designed to blow up planets were fired straight at the craft world. It's telling that even the Warhammer wiki makes sure to let you know that if a single squadron of fighters was left back at home, this wouldn't have been an issue. But because the craft world's built-in defenses were designed for larger ships, not torpedoes, it was only able to destroy 35 of them. That last one blew a big ol' hole in Iyanden's side, killing tens of thousands of Eldar and even worse, destroying their soul stones. Because Iriel made the mistake every beginner RTS player does and threw everything at once at the enemy, a good hunk of Iyanden's population was being greeted by Slaanesh herself. Not exactly a good look for the guy. When called to explain himself, instead of showing remorse, Iriel doubled down and called everyone else a pussy for not being as ballsy as he was, saying it was necessary. Iyanden's council responded by saying the only thing necessary was for him to get the hell off the craft world and think about what he did. And so in exile, he took what few Eldar were willing to support him and pissed right off. Something noteworthy here is that the flame of Assyrian that had burned brighter every time Iyanden did something cool had burned out with this, showing that he no longer favored them to reclaim the old empire. Side note, but I find that incredibly funny. Like, by this point Assyrian is very dead inside of Slaanesh's stomach, or at least as dead as a god can be, but he made sure to let the craft world know that they done goofed big time with this little kerfuffle. I'd say that maybe he could have used some of that power to, you know, stop that last torpedo from breaching the hull. But the Eldar gods are based on the Greek gods. The Greek pantheon is nothing if not one big collection of colossal cockheads, so I'd say it adds up. Iyanden pretty quickly got all grim and depressed over this, and Wraith units went from something that was needed to keep the momentum up to something that was needed to keep any form of military presence up. And naturally, things were only just beginning to get bad. Eldrad himself warned them all that the Tyranids were coming around again, only this time even worse. To which the craft world collectively told him to shove his predictions where the stars don't shine. They beat them before and they'll do it again. They accused him of just trying to better his and Oathway's standing in Eldar society, because yeah, that makes sense. The craft world that physically couldn't move away from the bleeding anus in reality was trying to steal their territory. This makes sense. Roughly a year goes by, and then the seers of Iyanden finally start to read the writing on the walls that anyone with half a brain could have seen. They realize that, oh shit, this high fleet is one of the big ones. They tried to turn around and beeline to the galactic core to get away, but apparently the turning radius of something planet-sized is quite big, and so there was no chance of getting away in time. In desperation, they sent out their fleet into perimeter in space to track Tyranid movements. When the Rangers started finding the high fleet scouts, they harassed them. Still the Tyranids came. When larger groups of Tyranids came around, the Rangers and scouting fleets both harassed them to weaken the Tyranid forces. Still the Tyranids came. At one point, they detonated a goddamn sun that High Fleet Kraken was positioned around. Still the Tyranids came. Not only was High Fleet Kraken assaulting the Ultramarines with half of its power, the other half was beelining straight towards Iyanden. How kind of the Nids to remember not to play favorites. Believe it or not though, Iyanden didn't stand alone. The rest of the craft worlds had sent military forces to aid them, with Biel-Tan poetically sending more than anyone else. Granted, this was probably just because when Iyanden said they needed help defending their home from Tyranids, all that Biel-Tan heard was kill many aliens, but hey, it's the thought that counts. The Avatar of Cain was awakened to probably get one-shot by a Termagant. There were even a few Harlequins kicking around. Every single last soul in the Infinity Circuit was put into service as a Wraith Guard. This was Iyanden's last stand. At first, Iyanden's fleet was actually able to hold off the Tyranids. Their admiral, Ethrael, actually managed to completely destroy the first few waves, but unfortunately there's never just a few waves of Tyranids. By the time the biggest and final wave rolled around, the Eldar fleet was left with nothing. And even when Admiral Ethrael threw his ship into the middle of the High Fleet and pulled Imagine Vegeta, they kept breaching into Iyanden. What followed was essentially one long rearguard action into the depths of the craft world. The Tyranids were butchered en masse, but their losses were inconsequential so long as they kept up the assault. Meanwhile, every inch the Eldar lost, every life taken, was devastating. As the craft world's forces retreated further and further, a Farseer named Kelman Farsight, loving the creativity on that one, saw that Iyanden was doomed in every single reading of the future he did. Then a Harlequin interrupted his emo session and told him to make his own goddamn fate. In desperation, he called out to the outcast Iriel. He couldn't even get a message out before the Tyranids breached his sanctum and murdered the seers helping him, but he'd done enough. For you see, Iriel hadn't just been sitting on his ass listening to whatever the Eldar equivalent of Linkin Park is. He'd been busy gathering his own little pirate fleet to sail the stars with. Every time someone tried to take him down a notch, he'd either destroy them, or if they were other Eldar raiders, assimilate them into his own Corsair fleet. The Imperium would sometimes try and pin him against other Corsair bands of pirates, but that would just end with Iriel's getting even bigger. Imagine playing a game of Risk and trying to set two players against each other so you could consolidate your own side of the board, only for one of them to eat the other, and now he holds Australia to top it off. That's kind of what Iriel was up to, only with space pirates and therefore more awesome. From Kelman's garbled message, he managed to glean that Iyanden was about 10 minutes away from being vored completely instead of only mostly, and so he rallied every single ship in his command and decided that he was going to make one hell of a re-entrance back home. In moments, all the Tyranid ships were just a memory. Granted, of the 100 ships Iriel brought, only a third were left, but given that he had just erased an entire hive fleet from reality, I'd say that's a pretty good showing of things. Of course, there was still, all of the Tyranids left Craftworld side, planet side, whatever. So Uriel marched his cyberpunk-looking ass back home, grabbed a cursed spear that would slowly devour the life force of its wielder, and stabbed a hive tyrant so hard that the hive mind itself felt pain. If anyone has any other instances in lore when someone hurt the Tyranid so bad the hive mind itself was in agony, please let me know, because as it stands, it's 1-0 in favor of the Eldar on that front. Yet another example of the Space Elves being better than everyone. On the off chance this video hasn't made you retch out a stream of vomit yet, Mr. Remembrancer, please remember that human psychers who make any form of contact with the hive mind inevitably go insane, while Uriel just went, damn, that was a bit rough. At least the hive tyrant's dead, though. He was more worried about the spear he was holding, not the Tyranids he just stabbed so hard they all felt it. To say the victor was a bit Pyrrhic would be an understatement, though, as after all this was said and done, 4/5 of all the Eldar in the Craftworld had bitten the dust. For an incredibly slim bit of silver lining, though, all of the dead refused to be put back into the Infinity Circuit. Turns out that was only possible because all of the deaths seriously messed up Iyanden's feng shui, but hey, Wraithguard are real handy to have lying around. And soon they formed their own ghost courts to reign over and also help the living out if they were so inclined at the moment. Iyanden was now divided between those who wanted to nurse their wounds and heal up and those who wanted to die out in a blaze of glory. They settled on compromising between both parties, which is explicitly stated to make neither side happy, but it did keep them from getting into a civil war while they were incredibly weak, so I guess that's something. There was also the time an orc horde nearly wiped out Iyanden as well, which if you're keeping track, this is the third time they've gotten their shit rocked. At first it was just Iyanden clearing out a system that was pretty infested with the Green Boys, and then a Space Hulk just coincidentally popped out next to Iyanden. Both sides for a moment just stared at each other when this happened. Neither of them could believe their luck, though in the orcs' case it was more good luck than bad luck. Then they opened fire and things got bad. This time they got saved by the Dark Eldar of all people, who helped them destroy these orcs for good. The Craftworlders asked their edgy cousins why the hell they had helped them, and they replied that they loved how much angst Iyanden had over using the Wraithguard that they couldn't let such delicious suffering pass into the void. You know, the Dark Eldar really are just the supervillains of 40k. They have presentation for their evilness in spades. Then the Tyranids almost destroyed them again, before they got saved by the Deldar and Biel-Tan again. Are you noticing a pattern with how these bastards make it out of these problems alive? As of their most recent lore, they've mostly thrown their lot in with the Ynnari. It's telling for how screwed they all are that the ones who oppose the Ynnari aren't even doing it because they dislike the idea. They just think if too many elves leave to go help the Ynnari, they'll leave the Craftworld totally undefended. Now, Iyanden is the Craftworld I chose to represent my tabletop army, so allow me to give you a short list of things about them that make them the Chad Eldar. Unlike all the others, they actually have colonies to rebuild the Empire with. Even Biel-Tan doesn't do that. They just murder everyone on a maiden world and go, yeah, that's all the work we needed to do. They even set up colonies on regular whatever planets, not just maiden worlds where life is on easy mode. Funnily enough, this makes me think that if they recalled all their colonists, they'd actually go back to being the most populated Craftworld again. They just would rather not have all their eggs in one basket like all the other elves, which is very smart. They also regularly play the part of diplomats with other races, most frequently humanity. Indeed, not only do they host inquisitors amongst themselves, but at one point the Inquisition actually had a little base on the Craftworld. That is insane. They also have diplomatic envoys sent to Imperial worlds that are entirely open to the public. They're good enough friends with mankind that they don't mind being seen walking around with Xenos. One of the characters in the last Chancellor's Guard regiment was jailed for taking one of their crafts on a joyride, which aside from being hilarious imagining some random schmuck accidentally sending a wave serpent into a tree, shows that they were public enough knowledge that some random schmuck could feasibly do such a thing. Indeed, they've even been willing to stand down for open conflict against humanity, despite every other Craftworld and indeed almost every other race besides the Tau almost never doing such a thing. When they went to recover whatever they could from Craftworld Malantai after it got Nam, they were initially angered over the fact that humans were desecrating the halls of the Eldar, those humans being Grey Knights for reference. Slaanesh had taken a bit of an interest given that all these dead soulstones were just lying around waiting to be eaten. Bit rude, admittedly, to immediately be angry over the Grey Knights standing on the Craftworld, but given how that sort of thing usually goes, you can hardly fault them for it. But when the Grey Knights returned all of the salvaged spirit stones they managed to save, Iyanden pretty quickly changed their tune and thanked them for it. Not in the usual Eldar manner of thanks, but I assure you we could have done 1,000 times better than you idiots, now get the hell out. They just graciously thanked thanked them for the service they had done. And when they worked with the Dark Angels, Iyanden's Wraith forces were the ones leading the charge up front. It wasn't the sneaky Eldar moving around all the real fighting while the humans were the meat shields. Can you see why I liked them so much and indeed use these fellas for my tabletop army? Well, yes, they're still Eldar and arrogant. See them refusing to consider High Fleet Kraken a threat. They're arrogant in a way that actually makes sense. They fought the worst the galaxy has to offer and always came out on top, and they have a legacy of guiding the Eldar forward that anyone would be proud of. And yet they still acknowledge that they aren't the end-all be-all of creation, and there's something to be gained from working with the other races in the galaxy. Maybe a bit too much of a faction of goody two-shoes for your liking, but I say sometimes you need that kind of thing. That was all well and good, so how about we get into what you get for taking Iyanden on the tabletop? A mini do or don't for them, because this is what I'm going to be doing more of when I run out of main factions to cover, so here it is in advance so you know what it'll look like when I really run out of content. Well, pick them if you want Eldar that aren't utter douchebags. That's the summary of their lore positives over the other Eldar. They're good people by 40k standards, and they'll save other races from doom almost as happily as other Eldar, though as you might have noticed in the lore, they're the ones who'll be getting saved more often than not. Rules positives: add 1 to combat attrition test for whenever you take a casualty, so it'll be a bit easier for your guardians to not cower and leave the battlefield at a moment's notice. Additionally, if something with an armor penetration value of 1 or 2 fires at you, reduce it by 1, so AP1 becomes 0 and AP2 becomes 1. Pretty handy, all things considered, especially given that GW's approach to so many people having AP attacks is to give everyone else AP attacks. The Warlord gets a 5+, a stratagem lets a Spirit Seer buff Wraith units from anywhere on the board, and one very funny thing they can do is give a Wraith unit not only battle focus, but +1 to their attack value as well. You know how Wraith units are incredibly slow and cumbersome? Iyanden Wraithguard are just built different, only thankfully for them, there's no Adam Smasher here to pile drive them straight to Slaanesh. I don't feel bad for saying that, the show's been out for nearly a month now, and I haven't even seen it yet, so yes, I am just soft spoiling it right now to take out my frustrations for it having been spoiled for me. I will be as petulant as I want, thank you very much. As for lore negatives, look, I'll be honest with you. Their theme is rising from the ashes of defeat, which is nice and all, but it means that in-universe you will regularly be getting your shit handed to you on a silver platter and needing someone else to bail you out. You can spin this into a positive and say that they're the only people smart enough to make friends, but you're also still fighting a war of attrition you've already lost. 80% of your army is made up of the dead. That's not a sign that you're doing very good. I'm very biased towards Iyanden, so that's it here. Kiss my sugar-free ass. It's my video and I only list the downsides I want to. For tabletop though, well, here's the thing about that. Wraith units are Iyanden's specialty. Their stratagems are all about buffing Wraith units, and in lore, Wraith units are the majority of what they use. But Wraith units are in a bit of a rough spot. Them reducing incoming damage by 1 is great, and they're tough even besides that, but there's a lot of downsides to them. Wraith Knights are expensive as hell, and point for point perform worse than their Imperial Knight equivalents. Wraith Lords are... actually, they're pretty good, but they're a Dreadnought equivalent and you'll be feeling that price when you select one. And Wraithguard are very good in a vacuum, but they don't exist in a vacuum. They're slow as hell, requiring either a Deep Strike or a Wave Serpent transport to get them where they need to be. And while they're more versatile than other Eldar units, their cost effectiveness is seriously up for debate. For the same price, you can get roughly double the amount of Fire Dragons for destroying enemy vehicles, or Banshee/Scorpions for melee fights. A Spirit Seer is also almost a necessity if you want them performing their best, so there's another point tax for taking Wraith units. Basically, Iyanden's gimmick unit is perhaps one of the worst ones in the Eldar arsenal. Not because they're bad units, but because you need so many things to make them work well, it might just be worth it to invest your points elsewhere. What sounds more appealing? A unit of Wraithguard, the Wave Serpent need to get them anywhere, and a Spirit Seer on top of it all, or an Avatar of Cain that will destroy almost anything you can throw it at? Because they're roughly equivalent in point cost, but an Avatar of Cain can one-shot a Titan if it rolls well. Also, the buff to combat attrition tests may as well not exist. The Eldar have plenty of downsides on the tabletop, but morale isn't one of them. It's helpful for Guardians, yeah, but for pretty much every other unit, it's not really going to make much of a difference. Prince Uriel is also kind of a mediocre character. He used to be a lot worse, and now he's okay. He's a unique Eldar character, which is something. Not really good enough to put him in pros, though, to be honest with you. Shame. And that's Craftworld Iyanden. Proof that even the Eldar can have nice people amongst them. Sure, they may be down, but they're not out, and all their casualties just mean that they have more Wraithguard to throw at people. Because in-universe, point cost values aren't a thing, so 10,000 Wraithguard showing up to absolutely butcher you is an entirely valid possibility. Actual Orc content to come soon, and in case anyone still gives a damn, here's the Zomboid server information again. As stated before, either survive with me, or I will cave your head in with a brick. Thank you, of course, to my wonderful channel members. You are the Wraithguard to my Iyanden, generously supporting me from beyond the grave. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there. Now here's a question for all you Eldar experts out there. Wraithbone is the material the Eldar use for pretty much everything. It's a psychic material that can be shaped depending on the Eldar's needs and wants. It makes up pretty much everything from their clothing, to their weapons, to the Craftworlds themselves. It can be as hard as adamantium or as soft as silk. With that in mind, is it possible to give a Wraithguard a Wraithbone fleshlight? These are the questions the Games Workshop really needs to answer. I don't give a damn about the Emperor gaining power or what Primarch is coming back next. These are the questions I want answered. What is the canonicity of that Wraith bussy?